The morning of the 8th of June, 1979, began like any other in Fairhaven. The town was easing into summer. Kids rode their bikes barefoot down sidewalks still slick with morning dew. Radios buzzed with the week's top hits, Donna Summer's Hot Stuff and Rod Stewart's Do Ya Think I'm Sexy, songs that poured out of car windows and corner diners alike. For most people, it was just another Friday. But for Margaret Ellis, it would be her last known day. 25 years later, on a gray November morning in 1984, two hikers cut through a trail in rural Pennsylvania that hadn't been touched in decades. They weren't looking for treasure, just some peace and quiet, a break from the noise of their everyday lives. But under a mess of tangled roots and damp leaves, their boots struck something solid. They bent down, brushed away the dirt, and froze. It wasn't a rock. It was a case, an old, leather briefcase, eaten by years of moisture and time. And when they cracked it open, the forest suddenly felt heavier, because inside were lesson plans, graded papers, and a photograph of a smiling woman who had disappeared 25 years earlier. Her name was Margaret Ellis, a 32-year-old high school English teacher who vanished without a trace in 1979. Her car was found abandoned, her purse still inside. No signs of a struggle, just gone. For decades, her story drifted into the realm of whispers, students wondering, townsfolk speculating. Her family left aching with questions. And now, here in the quiet woods, a briefcase had clawed her name back into the headlines. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it all began. Margaret Ellis wasn't the kind of teacher students forgot. She had a laugh that carried down the hallway, a tendency to quote Shakespeare at the most unexpected times, and a collection of scarves that matched her every mood. Her students used to joke that you could tell what kind of day it would be in class by the scarf she wore. Bright yellows and blues meant lively debates and easier quizzes. Dark greens or blacks usually meant essays, long ones. Born in 1947, Margaret grew up in a modest home on the outskirts of town. Her father worked at the steel mill, her mother in the local library. Books, stories, and words were the lifeblood of the Ellis household. Her younger sister, Claire, often remembered how Margaret would read out loud to her at night, creating voices for every character. By the time she was 15, Margaret already knew she wanted to teach. In the fall of 1975, she accepted a position at Ridgewood High, a small but proud school in a Pennsylvania town where everyone knew everyone else. Ridgewood was the kind of place where Friday night football was sacred, and gossip spread faster than the morning paper. And yet, Margaret quickly found her rhythm. Students adored her, parents respected her, colleagues admired the way she carried herself with both kindness and authority. But beneath the laughter and the scarves, friends noticed a quiet loneliness. Margaret was unmarried, though she'd been on her share of dates. She was polite about it, shrugging off questions with a smile, but those closest to her knew she longed for something more. A partner, a family, something permanent. The autumn of 1979 seemed ordinary enough. Ridgewood High was buzzing with the usual chaos of football games, homecoming dances, and exams. Margaret was in the thick of it all, helping students polish essays, coaching the debate team, and planning a winter reading list that she promised would change the way you look at the world. Her last confirmed sighting was on a chilly Friday night in early November. She had just stayed late after school, grading essays and preparing for Monday's lessons. The janitor, Mr. Harlan, recalled seeing her leave around 7 p.m. She was carrying her usual leather briefcase, wrapped in a deep red scarf. He remembered because she stopped to chat for a few minutes about the weather turning cold. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. The next morning, Margaret's car was found abandoned along a quiet stretch of road just outside town. The driver's door was locked, the keys were missing, and her purse sat on the passenger seat. Inside, her wallet, driver's license, and a few crumpled bills. Nothing had been stolen, nothing made sense. Her family grew frantic almost immediately. Claire remembered calling Margaret that Saturday morning, hoping to meet for brunch, but the call went unanswered. By evening, she was pacing, knowing in her gut that something was wrong. When Margaret failed to show up for Sunday dinner, a ritual she never missed, the alarm bells could no longer be ignored. Police were notified, flyers were printed, neighbors joined the search. At first, officers leaned toward the possibility that Margaret had simply left on her own, that maybe she'd grown tired of small-town life and wanted a change. But those who knew her insisted that wasn't the case. Margaret wasn't reckless. She wasn't the type to walk away without telling anyone, and certainly not without her beloved briefcase, the one that had practically become an extension of her arm. And that, perhaps, is what made the hiker's discovery 25 years later so haunting. That briefcase had traveled with Margaret everywhere. To school, to staff meetings, even to family dinners sometimes. And now, buried in the woods, it was whispering a story the town had long tried to forget. But before we get there, we need to step back into 1979, to the classrooms she filled with laughter, to the friends and students who adored her, and to the eerie, unraveling days after Margaret Ellis vanished, days that would change Ridgewood forever. November 9th, 1979, began like any other Friday for Margaret Ellis. The crisp autumn air had settled over Ridgewood, and the sidewalks were blanketed with fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. Students shuffled into Ridgewood High carrying backpacks, complaining about exams, whispering about weekend plans. Inside room 214, Margaret was already at her desk, sorting through stacks of essays, a steaming mug of coffee nearby. She greeted her students with her trademark energy, scarf draped elegantly over her shoulder, a deep crimson, one that matched the turning maples outside. It was a normal school day. At least, that's what everyone thought. By late afternoon, most of the school had emptied. Students rushed off to football practice, the library, or home to start the weekend. The janitor, Mr. Harlan, noticed that Margaret lingered in her classroom longer than usual. She often did. Papers piled up quickly, and she liked to leave her desk clear before the week's end. Around 6:45 p.m., he passed her room and saw her standing by the chalkboard, erasing notes from a lesson on Macbeth. Her briefcase sat open on the desk, filled with folders and notebooks. She smiled, said goodnight, and asked if the boilers were going to kick on early this year, Harlan later told police. Nothing seemed out of place. She was just Margaret. 5 matey, is like family. But that ordinary exchange would be the last anyone had with her. At 7:12 p.m., a secretary working late in the office heard the front doors close. She assumed it was Margaret. The sound echoed down the hallway, then silence. By the time Harlan finished his rounds, Margaret's car was gone from the lot. She had slipped into the November night, carrying her briefcase, wrapped in that red scarf. Where she went next is still one of Ridgewood's deepest mysteries. The next morning, a jogger spotted her car. It was parked neatly on the side of a narrow country road about 4 miles from town. Not on the shoulder like a vehicle in distress, but tucked almost deliberately, as though placed with care. The jogger didn't think much of it at first. But when he saw the same car later that evening, unmoved, curiosity pushed him to take a closer look. The car was locked. Through the window, her purse was clearly visible on the passenger seat. Inside, Margaret's wallet, Idaho, credit cards, and a few personal items. Nothing appeared disturbed. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no tire marks on the soft shoulder nearby. By Sunday morning, when word reached her family, panic began to spread. Claire Ellis, Margaret's younger sister, was the first to call police. "Something's wrong," she told the dispatcher. "My sister would never just disappear. She would never leave without telling me." At first, the police response was measured, almost hesitant. Adults, they reminded Claire, sometimes chose to leave. They ran away, started new lives, disappeared from small towns where everyone knew their name. But Claire pushed back, her voice sharp with emotion. She loved her job, she loved her students, she just got tenure. She wouldn't leave everything behind, not without her family, not without her briefcase. By Sunday evening, Ridgewood buzzed with unease. Margaret had missed a family dinner, something she never did. Friends called one another, confirming the last times they'd spoken to her. Teachers remembered her cheerfulness that Friday morning. Students remembered joking with her in the hallway. No one had noticed anything unusual, and yet, Margaret was gone. The first official search took place on Monday. Officers canvassed the area around the abandoned car. Volunteers combed through the woods with flashlights, their breath visible in the chilly air. Dogs were brought in to track her scent, but they struggled to hold a trail beyond a few hundred feet from the roadside. It was as if Margaret had stepped out of her car and vanished into thin air. Newspapers ran the story immediately. "Local teacher missing" blared across the Ridgewood Gazette. Her smiling school photo accompanied the article. Neighbors clipped the paper, taping it to their refrigerators, shaking their heads in disbelief. A beloved teacher doesn't just vanish. Not here, not in Ridgewood. But behind the headlines, unsettling questions began to surface. Why was her car parked on that lonely stretch of road? Where was she going on a Friday night? And why, above all, would she leave her purse and wallet behind? Investigators noted something else too. Margaret's briefcase, the one she never went anywhere without, was missing. And for the next 25 years, so was she. By Monday morning, November 12, 1979, Ridgewood was no longer a quiet town. Word of Margaret's disappearance spread like wildfire, carried by phone calls, whispered conversations in the grocery store, and the constant chatter at the diner. Posters with her photo, black and white copies of her staff portrait, were taped to every telephone pole and shop window. Beneath her picture, bold letters read, "Missing. Have you seen Margaret Ellis?" Her students were some of the first to react. Teenagers who had once teased her about her scarves now found themselves walking the hallways in silence, her empty classroom a haunting reminder of the sudden void. A group of girls from her English class made a banner that read, "Come home, Miss Ellis," and hung it across the front entrance of the high school. Teachers tried to keep lessons moving, but the air in Ridgewood High was heavy. Everyone knew something was very, very wrong. The search effort grew quickly. Dozens of volunteers showed up at the Ridgewood Fire Hall, bundled in jackets, ready to help. Farmers lent their ATVs. Hunters offered knowledge of the surrounding woods. Mothers arrived with trays of sandwiches and thermoses of coffee. People wanted to do something, anything, to help find Margaret. Police organized search parties, combing through the wooded area near where her car had been found. Helicopters buzzed overhead, scanning fields and tree lines. The local river was dragged. Crews poked through abandoned barns and old sheds, hoping for a trace. At night, flashlights cut through the darkness as volunteers refused to give up. From above, it must have looked like a constellation of lights scattered across the Pennsylvania hills. Still, the forest gave up no answers. For Margaret's family, those first days were torture. Claire Ellis barely slept. She carried the phone from room to room, waiting for it to ring, praying it would be Margaret calling. Their mother sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched teacup Margaret had left behind during her last visit. Her father paced the living room, checking the front window every few minutes, as if she might come walking up the driveway any second. "I remember the smell of coffee," Claire would later say. That week, the house just smelled like coffee, because nobody could stop making it. We were afraid to sit still, afraid of silence. We thought if we stayed awake, she might come home. The police, meanwhile, faced mounting pressure. Ridgewood had never dealt with a case like this before. Missing persons were rare, and usually resolved within hours. But here they were, with a popular school teacher gone, a car abandoned, and no leads. Detectives interviewed her colleagues, her neighbors, and even her students. Had she seemed troubled? Had she been fighting with anyone? Was there a secret boyfriend? A debt? A reason to leave? The answers were always the same: no. Margaret was steady, responsible, loved. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't impulsive. She wasn't the type to run. Still, suspicion has a way of filling silence. Rumors began to spread. Some whispered she'd been seeing someone in secret, maybe someone married. Others said she might have been planning to leave Ridgewood for a bigger city. A darker story suggested she'd been followed by a stranger, or maybe by someone she knew. Teenagers traded theories in hushed tones, while their parents warned them not to walk alone after dark. The town that once felt safe suddenly didn't. Doors that were rarely locked were now bolted at night. Porch lights stayed on until morning. Parents picked up their children from school instead of letting them walk. A shadow had settled over Ridgewood. In the middle of all this, police staged a dramatic search on the third day. They brought in bloodhounds, hoping to track Margaret's scent from her abandoned car. For a brief, electrifying moment, it seemed to work. The dogs pulled handlers into the woods, noses down, straining against their leashes. Volunteers followed, hearts pounding, certain they were about to find her. But just as quickly as it began, the trail went cold. The dogs circled, confused, whined, and then sat down. It was as if Margaret had simply disappeared into the air itself. By the end of the week, frustration was setting in. Reporters arrived from neighboring towns, crowding the police station steps, pressing detectives for answers. The Ridgewood Gazette ran the headline, "No trace of missing teacher." Below it, a grim subheading, "Police say leads have stalled." For the Ellis family, it was unbearable. Claire stood in front of the cameras, clutching her sister's photograph, pleading with the public. "If anyone knows anything at all, please come forward. We just want Margaret back." Her voice cracked. The cameras captured every second. But no one came forward. No mysterious caller, no ransom note, no hidden letter, just silence. And in that silence, Ridgewood began to fracture. Some still clung to hope. Others whispered that Margaret was gone for good. And as days turned into weeks, the search parties grew smaller. The flyers weathered and curled on the telephone poles, the lights on porches dimmed, and a chilling thought began to take root in the town. Maybe Margaret Ellis wasn't coming back. As the weeks passed, Ridgewood's grief turned into something else: anxious speculation. With no answers from the police, the town began filling in the blanks themselves. Coffee shop chatter turned into theories, and theories turned into rumors. Before long, Margaret's disappearance had grown into a story bigger than the woman herself. The first rumor claimed Margaret had a secret boyfriend. People swore they had seen her laughing with someone in a car outside the diner, a man who wasn't from town. Some insisted he was married, and that Margaret had been drawn into something dangerous. But when police questioned her closest friends, none of them could recall her mentioning a man in her life. Claire scoffed at the theory. "She told me everything. She wasn't seeing anyone. That's just something people wanted to believe because it made her disappearance easier to explain." Another rumor took a darker turn. A group of students claimed that Margaret had been followed in the weeks before she vanished. They said she once looked over her shoulder while walking to her car after debate practice, scanning the lot nervously. When detectives pressed them for details, the stories wavered. Some said it was a stranger in a pickup truck. Others claimed it was a man in a dark coat. Nothing solid ever materialized. Still, the seed had been planted. What if Margaret had been stalked? Then came the strangest theory of all. In December of 1979, a man phoned the Ridgewood Police Department claiming to be a psychic. He said he had visions of Margaret near water, specifically, near the old quarry on the edge of town. Desperate for a lead, officers actually checked it out. Volunteers searched the frozen edges of the quarry, poking through the brush and shallow ice. They found nothing, of course, but the story spread like wildfire. Soon, kids dared each other to sneak to the quarry at night, whispering that Margaret's ghost haunted the cliffs. The case was already drifting toward legend. Reporters loved it. Out-of-town newspapers picked up the story, framing Ridgewood as a community haunted by mystery. Headlines ranged from sympathetic to sensational. "Beloved teacher vanishes without a trace" appeared in one paper, while another boldly asked, "Is a killer stalking Ridgewood?" Every reporter seemed to carry a new theory. Some claimed Margaret had been targeted by a cult. Others hinted at UFOs. The national attention brought tips, but most were useless. A sighting in Ohio, a waitress in New Jersey who swore a woman matching Margaret's description had come through her diner. Police chased them all, and every single one ended in a dead end. Behind closed doors, detectives considered more sobering possibilities. Could Margaret have been abducted by someone she knew? A fellow teacher? A student's parent? Quietly, they dug into the lives of the people closest to her. They interviewed colleagues, searched through her bank accounts, even spoke with men she had dated years earlier. Nothing suspicious turned up. But with every door that closed, frustration grew. By the spring of 1980, hope was starting to thin. The Ellis family still pushed, refusing to let her memory fade. They held vigils at the high school, candles flickering against the night sky. Claire kept Margaret's bedroom exactly as it was, the books stacked on her nightstand, the floral quilt smoothed across the bed. "I wanted her to walk through the door and feel like nothing had changed," she said later. But while the family clung to hope, the town began moving on. The school hired a new English teacher. Margaret's desk was cleared, her lesson plans boxed up. Students still spoke about her, but less and less with each passing year. Graduation classes rolled forward, and fewer kids remembered the woman in the colorful scarves who had once filled room 214 with laughter. The case files, meanwhile, grew thick with dead ends. Police logged over 200 tips in the first year alone. They looked at ex-boyfriends, traveling salesmen, even transient workers passing through town. Nothing stuck. Every promising lead evaporated. One detective years later admitted, "It was like chasing smoke. We thought we had something, and then it slipped right through our fingers." But despite the silence, Margaret's story never truly left Ridgewood. She became the town's open wound, the mystery that hovered at the edges of every conversation. Parents warned their daughters not to drive alone at night. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. And all the while, the questions lingered. Who took her? Why? And where had she gone? Questions that would remain unanswered for decades until a briefcase emerged from the dirt. By the early 1980s, Margaret's disappearance had settled into the category investigators dread most, a cold case. The search parties dwindled. The reporters left town. The flyers peeled away from telephone poles, leaving behind only faint tape marks. Ridgewood returned to its routines, but something had shifted forever. The story of Margaret Ellis became less a daily crisis and more a ghost in the background of everyday life. For her family, though, time didn't dull the pain. Claire Ellis became the keeper of her sister's memory. She refused to let Margaret fade into the past. Every holiday, she placed a photo of Margaret at the dinner table. Every birthday, she baked her sister's favorite lemon cake. Friends and relatives sometimes found it difficult to be around her during those times. Her grief was relentless, unsoftened by the years. But Claire didn't care. "If I stop," she once said, "it's like admitting she's never coming back, and I can't do that." Their parents aged quickly under the weight of loss. Margaret's father grew stooped and quiet, often sitting for hours on the porch, staring down the road. Her mother's once bright energy dimmed, her laughter vanishing from family gatherings. They lived the rest of their lives with an empty chair at the table, waiting for a daughter who never walked through the door. The town, meanwhile, tried to move on. Ridgewood High continued without Margaret, though the classroom she once taught in carried an unshakable sadness. Some students avoided it, whispering that it was haunted. Teachers who'd been there in 1979 remembered her laugh echoing through the halls, and when a scarf was found years later in the lost and found box, more than one colleague admitted it gave them chills. Every so often, Margaret's name would resurface. A new detective assigned to the case, a magazine article revisiting unsolved mysteries, a psychic who claimed fresh visions. Each time, the Ellis family would brace themselves for answers that never came, and each time, they were left disappointed. By the late 1980s, the case had slipped into the margins. Ridgewood had seen new tragedies, new scandals, new stories to distract from the lingering pain of the past. Younger generations grew up hearing about Margaret not as a teacher, but as a legend. The woman who vanished. Some kids told stories at sleepovers, swearing that if you drove past the quarry at midnight, you could see a woman in a red scarf walking along the road. Her name became folklore. But for her family, the absence was anything but a ghost story. It was daily life. Claire visited the police station every year on the anniversary of her sister's disappearance. She pressed detectives for updates, handed them new notebooks full of her own theories, and begged them not to let the case gather dust. Most of the time, the officers were sympathetic but helpless. Without new evidence, there was nothing to chase. The 1990s brought new hope in the form of technology. DNA databases, computerized records, and fresh forensic methods gave cold case detectives more tools than ever before. When Margaret's file was briefly reopened in 1993, the family was told her belongings, her purse, her wallet, the contents of her car were being re-examined, but nothing new emerged. No DNA match, no hidden clue, no sudden breakthrough. Claire's frustration boiled over. She wrote letters to senators, governors, even the FBI, begging for help. "If this happened to someone else's daughter, sister, teacher," she wrote, "would we still be waiting 20 years later?" The letters went unanswered. By the turn of the millennium, Margaret had been gone for more than 2 decades. Ridgewood was no longer the same small town it had been in 1979. New shops lined the streets, old farms had been sold, and a whole generation had grown up without ever knowing her. Yet, for those who did remember, her absence still hurt. At Ridgewood High's 2000 reunion, alumni set aside a chair for her. They placed one of her old class photos on the table, her smile frozen in time. It seemed like the story of Margaret Ellis would remain forever unresolved. An ache in the heart of Ridgewood, a shadow that never left her family. Until, on a gray morning in 2004, 2 hikers stumbled on a buried briefcase in the woods, the object she never went anywhere without. The object police had searched for in vain 25 years earlier. And suddenly, the story wasn't cold anymore. It was November 2004, 25 years to the month, since Margaret Ellis vanished. The woods outside Ridgewood had grown wilder in the years since. the old trails half swallowed by undergrowth. On that chilly Saturday morning, two friends, Tom and Rachel, both avid hikers, set out with no destination in mind, just eager to stretch their legs and breathe in the sharp autumn air. They followed a deer path deeper into the woods, crunching over fallen leaves, their breath fogging in the cool air. The forest was hushed, damp with the smell of earth and pine. Around mid-morning, Tom's boot hit something hard just beneath the soil. At first, he thought it was a buried rock. But when he crouched down and brushed away the dirt, he realized it was something man-made, leather, worn, waterlogged, but unmistakable. A briefcase. Rachel bent down beside him, helping to pull it free from the tangled roots that had grown around it. The case was cracked and swollen with age, the brass clasps tarnished. They exchanged a look, half curiosity, half unease. What was a briefcase doing buried out here, miles from the nearest road? When they pried it open, the smell hit them first. Mold, mildew, the sharp sting of decades underground. Inside, papers lay warped and stained, their ink bleeding into unreadable smudges. But some things had survived. A gradebook, lesson plans, and tucked into a folder, a photograph of a smiling woman in her early 30s, wrapped in a patterned scarf. Rachel froze. "Tom," she whispered, "that's the teacher, the one who disappeared." She was right. It was Margaret Ellis. The hikers didn't hesitate. They closed the case and carried it out of the woods, their nerves prickling with every step. By that afternoon, the Ridgewood Police Department had the briefcase in their possession. Detectives who had long since filed away Margaret's case under cold now found themselves staring at the object that had defined her life, a piece of her that had been missing for 25 years. The discovery sent shockwaves through Ridgewood. The local paper broke the story first. Briefcase, linked to missing teacher found in woods. Within hours, the phone lines at the police station lit up with calls. Former students, old neighbors, curious locals, they all wanted to know what the briefcase meant. Was this the key to finally solving the mystery, or just another cruel reminder of what had been lost? For Claire Ellis, the call from police was surreal. She rushed to the station, her hands trembling as detectives laid out the contents on a table. The papers were brittle, the ink faded, but she recognized her sister's handwriting instantly. Her breath caught when she saw the photograph. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my Margaret." The briefcase, Claire said, was like an extension of her sister. She carried it everywhere, to school, to our parents' house, even to the diner on weekends. If Margaret went somewhere, that briefcase went too. If it's here, if it's been buried all these years, then she was here too. Her words hung heavy in the air. The implication was unavoidable. Wherever Margaret had gone that night in 1979, her briefcase had followed, and someone had gone to the trouble of hiding it. Detectives treated the find like a crime scene. Forensic specialists were called in. Every page, every scrap of paper, every trace of dirt was cataloged and bagged. They tested the soil clinging to the case. They searched for fingerprints, fibers, anything that might point to who had placed it there. Even the roots tangled around the leather were examined, in hopes of estimating how long it had been underground. The case reopened officially. After 25 years, the mystery of Margaret Ellis was alive again. Ridgewood buzzed with renewed energy. Former students, now in their 40s and 50s, reached out to the Ellis family, sharing memories of their favorite teacher. Old neighbors speculated once again, digging up theories long buried. Reporters returned, their vans parked once more outside the police station. It felt like the whole town had been yanked back into 1979. But beneath the excitement was something darker: fear. If Margaret's briefcase had been hidden in the woods all this time, what else might be buried out there? The discovery of the briefcase didn't just reopen the case. It reopened every wound Ridgewood had spent 25 years trying to heal. And now, investigators had to ask, who buried it, and why? Was it a breadcrumb leading to the truth, or was it meant to distract them from something even darker? The forest had given up a secret, but what it hadn't given up, at least not yet, was Margaret Ellis herself. The briefcase was more than just an object. To investigators, it was a time capsule, a frozen piece of 1979 pulled from the dirt. Every smudged paper, every rusted clasp, every fiber of fabric was a potential clue. For the Ellis family, it was something even heavier, proof that Margaret hadn't simply walked away. Someone had taken steps to erase her. The forensic lab began with the basics. Soil samples confirmed the briefcase had been buried for decades. The roots entangled around it suggested it had been underground since the early 1980s, if not earlier. The papers inside were badly degraded, but Margaret's handwriting was still visible in places. Lesson notes, student grades, even a half-finished poem she'd jotted in the margins of a notebook. None of it pointed directly to her fate, but all of it whispered her presence. Then came something more tangible. On the inner lining of the briefcase, forensic specialists found fibers, dark, coarse threads that didn't match Margaret's clothing. They also recovered a faint fingerprint on a piece of plastic inside the case. It wasn't Margaret's. At first, the print was too partial to be of use. But with digital enhancement, analysts managed to make it clear enough to run through state and federal databases. And that's when things got interesting. The print came back as a match to a man named Richard Clemens, a former maintenance worker at Ridgewood High in the late 1970s. His name hadn't appeared in the original investigation, at least, not prominently. But when detectives dug into old employment records, they discovered he'd been fired from the school in 1980, just months after Margaret's disappearance. The official reason: misconduct. Rumors at the time suggested Clemens had been caught drinking on the job, maybe even harassing teachers. Nothing had ever been proven, and after he was let go, he drifted out of town. For decades, his name had faded into obscurity, but now, with a fingerprint on Margaret's briefcase, he was suddenly at the center of the mystery. Detectives tracked Clemens down in a neighboring state. He was in his late 60s now, living quietly, working odd jobs. When questioned, he denied everything. He claimed he barely remembered Margaret, and that if his fingerprint was on her briefcase, it must have been from normal contact back when he worked at the school. "I fix things all the time," he told them. "Maybe she asked me to fix a latch or something. That's all it could be." But the detectives weren't convinced. They pulled his old employment file, which painted a troubling picture. Repeated warnings about inappropriate behavior, complaints from staff about his temper, and rumors he'd followed a female teacher home once. Though none of it was enough for charges back then, it raised a chilling question. Had Clemens been lurking around Margaret too? The re-examination of the case also brought fresh witness interviews. Some former students recalled seeing Clemens talking to Margaret after class, lingering longer than seemed appropriate. One remembered a confrontation in the parking lot, a heated exchange where Margaret appeared upset. Another claimed he saw Clemens's truck near the road where Margaret's car was later found. At the time, those memories had seemed unreliable, blurred by teenage exaggeration. But now, they carried new weight. As investigators pieced things together, a theory began to emerge. Margaret may have left the school that night with her briefcase, intending to head home as always. But somewhere along the way, she encountered Clemens. Whether he confronted her at the school, followed her car, or lured her off the road, no one could say for sure. What seemed undeniable was that she never made it home, and the fact that her briefcase had been deliberately buried suggested someone was trying to hide it, someone who knew its significance. Police brought Clemens in for further questioning. He stuck to his story, insisting he had nothing to do with Margaret's disappearance. But when pressed about the night of November 9, 1979, his answers wavered. He claimed he couldn't remember where he was. He grew agitated, sweaty, his hands shaking. Detectives noted every nervous tick. Though they didn't yet have enough for an arrest, the case against him was building. For Claire, hearing Clemens' name was like being hit by a wave. She vaguely remembered him, an unfriendly face at school functions, someone Margaret had once referred to as overly familiar. The idea that he might have been involved all along made her furious. "If they had looked harder at him back then," she said, "maybe my sister wouldn't have been lost to us for 25 years. The briefcase had done more than reawaken old pain. It had ripped open a door investigators thought was sealed shut. And as they pressed deeper into Richard Clemens's past, they began to uncover a darkness that suggested Margaret Ellis's story wasn't just about a woman who vanished. It was about a predator who may have hidden in plain sight. The reopening of Margaret Ellis's case in 2004 brought something her family had almost given up on: momentum. After decades of silence, investigators were finally circling in on a suspect. The briefcase had cracked the door open, and Richard Clemens's name had come tumbling out. Now, detectives were determined to push further. Over the next year, investigators dug into every corner of Clemens's life. They tracked his movements after leaving Ridgewood in 1980. He'd bounced from job to job, often leaving abruptly under suspicious circumstances. Records showed he'd been investigated but never charged for harassing women at 2 different workplaces. In one case, he was accused of following a co-worker home and leaving unwanted notes on her car. The pattern was chilling. Then came the breakthrough. A former Ridgewood resident, now in her 50s, came forward after reading about the briefcase in the news. She told police she remembered something from the fall of 1979. She had been driving home late one Friday night when she saw a truck parked near where Margaret's car was later found. She recalled a man standing by the road, a silhouette in the headlights. Decades had dulled the details, but when shown a lineup of old photos, she pointed to Clemens without hesitation. "That's the man I saw," she said. "I'd stake my life on it." Armed with the fingerprint, the witness testimony, and his history of misconduct, investigators finally had enough. In the summer of 2006, Richard Clemens was arrested and charged with the abduction and murder of Margaret Ellis. The trial the following year was one of the most watched events in Ridgewood's history. Reporters packed the courtroom. Former students of Margaret's, now grown with children of their own, filled the benches. Claire Ellis sat in the front row every day, clutching her sister's scarf. The prosecution laid out a devastating case. Clemens had fixated on Margaret, harassed her at school, and confronted her the night she disappeared. They argued he intercepted her on the road, forced her into his vehicle, and ultimately killed her. The briefcase, they said, was buried to destroy evidence and sever her from the life she loved. Though Margaret's body was never found, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The fingerprint sealed it. The defense tried to poke holes, questioning the reliability of decades-old memories, insisting the fingerprint could have been innocently placed. But Clemens' own testimony worked against him. He grew angry, defensive, even hostile under cross-examination. Jurors saw not just a man denying guilt, but a man capable of rage. On the 3rd day of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty. Richard Clemens was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Claire, the moment was bittersweet. She wept openly as the judge read the sentence, her sobs echoing in the silent courtroom. "It doesn't bring her back," she told reporters, "but at least we know. At least he can't hurt anyone else." The town of Ridgewood responded with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Candlelight vigils were held once again, this time not for hope, but for remembrance. At Ridgewood High, alumni organized a memorial service for Margaret. They filled her old classroom with flowers, draped her favorite scarves over the desks, and read aloud from the books she once taught. Her students, some now teachers themselves, spoke about how she had shaped their lives. One said, "Every time I tell my kids to chase their dreams, I hear her voice in my head. She's still teaching us, even now." Closure came in the form of justice, but it was incomplete. Margaret's body was never found. The question of where she spent her final moments still haunted Claire. "I want to bring her home," she said in an interview. "I want to give her a proper resting place." Detectives searched properties Clemens had once owned, dug up fields, and even drained a pond based on tips, but nothing surfaced. It was as if Margaret herself remained determined to keep one last secret. In the end, Ridgewood finally had an answer to the question that had lingered for a quarter century: who took Margaret Ellis? But with that answer came a haunting realization. Evil hadn't come from outside the town. It had lived among them, unnoticed, working in the school, walking their streets. And for Claire, even with justice served, the empty chair at the family's table would never be filled. The trial of Richard Clemens gave Ridgewood the closure it had waited 25 years for. The guilty verdict answered the central question: who was responsible for Margaret Ellis's disappearance? And yet, when the crowds went home, when the cameras stopped rolling, a silence settled in, a silence filled not with relief, but with something darker. Because even with Clemens behind bars, not everything made sense. Investigators had dug through every scrap of evidence, every inch of the briefcase. Among Margaret's lesson plans and grade sheets, there had been one page that stood out: a sheet of paper with a single line written in her handwriting. It wasn't part of any lesson. It wasn't part of a draft. It was just one sentence, scrawled across the middle of the page. "He keeps watching me." No date, no name, no explanation. When the page was revealed in court, the prosecution used it to strengthen their case against Clemens. But privately, detectives admitted they couldn't prove when Margaret had written it, or if she was even referring to him. Was it a note about a colleague? A stranger? A cry for help? Or was it simply a fragment from a story she was writing for her students? Nobody could be sure. And then, there was the matter of her body. Despite exhaustive searches, despite interrogations of Clemens, despite cadaver dogs brought to every property he'd ever lived on, Margaret was never found. Clemens refused to speak of her final resting place. "You'll never know," he sneered once during a prison interview. "She's mine, and she'll stay mine." Those words chilled Claire more than the conviction ever soothed her. "It's like he wanted to hold on to her, even in death," she said, as if not telling us was his last act of control. Ridgewood still whispers about it. Some say her spirit lingers in the woods where the briefcase was found, watching the trails she never got to walk again. Others claim her old classroom is haunted, the sound of chalk scratching on a board, a scarf drifting to the floor with no one around to touch it. Students swear that sometimes, when the hallways are empty, you can hear a woman's laughter echoing faintly, only to vanish when you turn the corner. For Claire, the haunting detail isn't a ghost story. It's that unfinished page, those 3 words, "He keeps watching me." They've never left her mind. Because if Margaret had sensed danger, if she'd known someone was watching, then maybe her disappearance wasn't as sudden as everyone thought. Maybe the terror had been building, quietly, silently, right in front of them. The case of Margaret Ellis ended with a conviction, but not with peace. Her briefcase was found, her killer was named. Yet the most important piece, the woman herself, remains lost. And the single line she left behind still lingers like an echo, like a warning scribbled in the margins of time. "He keeps watching me." To this day, no one knows who she meant, or if the truth is still out there, buried, waiting to be found.